Hey there guys, we're taking a look at Dying Light running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U. Now this is of course with it running with 16 gigabytes of RAM available to it now. Of course the RAM usage that you're seeing there is just what the game itself is actually using, not just the entire system RAM usage. But overall, last time we tested the game, the performance that we were getting was pretty rough, and this is currently running at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphical settings, and you'll see that the performance numbers that we're getting are significantly better to where we were at before with just 8 gigabytes of RAM. This is definitely one of those games that really benefited from those 16 gigabytes because it really smoothed out those 1% lows, and we're getting a very playable experience here. And this is at 15 watts, by the way. This is the stock 15 watt configuration. I did not raise the TDP. This is how a lot of especially lower end systems with this chip are going to be shipping like. So 1080p is very playable, though it's not going to be the smoothest experience. Still, 1% lows that are in the 30s is going to pretty much mean that we're going to have a very consistent and very enjoyable experience. If you didn't have that FPS counter, you really would not be bothered by the performance most of the time. You will see that the frame times will fluctuate a little bit there, but it's usually in a way that doesn't really feel too detrimental because there's no sudden spikes. It's kind of just like a slow moving wave. So while there is fluctuation in the FPS, it's nothing that's too awful, but we can definitely improve this by dropping things down to 720p. Now at 720p, we pretty much end up in this situation where we're getting pretty much just a consistent 60 FPS average most of the time that we're playing with the lowest graphical settings. So again, 720p, lowest graphical settings. Performance that we're getting here is pretty spectacular. I had a very good time playing like this. It really just feels so much smoother, and the frame times are a lot more leveled out, and there's no real major waves or anything like that. So it really just feels extremely smooth. Now obviously the 1% lows are dipping below 60, but this laptop itself actually has a FreeSync display, which means that it is within the FreeSync range of this display. So you're going to actually be able to play the game without any noticeable screen tearing. Now you will notice it in the video itself because of the fact that the capture card that I use doesn't record with FreeSync, but the screen tearing that you see during the video itself is actually not present while playing the game because of the fact that the built-in display supports FreeSync. And you combine that FreeSync range with the level of performance that we're getting on here, and you pretty much end up in a situation where we're getting a very enjoyable experience. And again, this is at the stock 15 watt configuration, and I mentioned this before that from now on just showing 15 watts and 25 watts, just so that if you are someone that gets a system that only goes up to 15 watts, you will at least be able to understand the level of performance that you're at and maybe potentially what you can get by boosting up the performance. And really, this was the most satisfied I was with the performance, because another thing is that since it is at the 15 watts, it is running at a much lower temperature because of the fact that, you know, what leads to heat is just the amount of power that the system is using. So the fact that we're only using 15 watts instead of the full 25 means that the temperatures that we're at are much lower, and the system is just running quieter. It doesn't get as hot and it runs quieter. And this could be important to you because, you know, maybe you want to game, but maybe you don't want it to be in a loud scenario that makes things uncomfortable for people around you. Maybe you really just can't be in a situation where you can have the system just go full crazy loud or anything like that. So if you're in that kind of scenario, well, having it at just the 15 watts, you can see while playing a game, the temperatures it's at stay relatively cool. There's no real problems. It's actually pretty solid. But of course, if you do want to maximize the amount of performance that you can get out of this chip, you can of course raise the TDP. Now I actually did not end up testing the game for much at 720p with the 25 watt TDP, just because of the fact that what actually ended up happening was that because the performance was better, it was actually going above the FreeSync range of the display, but actually did reintroduce the screen tearing, so it wasn't exactly the greatest experience there. But at 1080p, I did note that it really wasn't that much of a performance increase overall, and I felt like it just wasn't really that beneficial. And let me show you that right now. So here you can see the game running at 1080p with the 25 watt TDP with the exact same graphical settings as before. Now really, we're mostly just seeing an uplift of maybe 1 or 2% overall. It's really negligible. It's just not that noticeable in terms of a performance uplift, and in all honesty, I think that the increased heat and noise is just not worth it for this game. And I'm curious to see actually how many games does that increase in TDP really make a difference, because at least so far what we've seen, it's not really that huge of an increase. And I mean, to be sure, it can be very beneficial to be able to actually be able to squeeze out a bit more performance, just because of the fact that if a game is just at the edge of playability and it just needs that small little push, it might just be enough to get it over the edge of playability. The problem is that for a lot of games, times it really won't make that big of a difference, and you're introducing just a lot more heat, and that heat is wear and tear, because the thing that kills hardware the most is heat. Heat is the thing that causes damage, and obviously you can't not have heat. Like as long as you're using electricity to power these devices, that electricity is going to have to be dissipated in some way, and that's going to be as heat. So you're always going to have this heat load that you're going to have to balance things around. But the fact that you can get this level of performance at 15 watts and you don't have to raise things, you're able to get pretty decent levels of performance on most games. You might not need to raise the TDP and introduce this extra damage, because while the chips themselves are rated to, I think the mobile Ryzen chips are rated to either 95 degrees or it might be 105 degrees, but that's just the CPU itself. There are a lot more chip components that are actually inside laptops, and a lot of the times they don't have temperature sensors. So if they don't have a temperature sensor, they can't really tell you if they're overheating or not. They themselves don't even know if they're overheating or not. The system doesn't know that there are components that are essentially being cooked. And I'm not saying that that happens in every single laptop, but when we're talking about cheaper systems, that is where manufacturers tend to cheap out on components, and a lot of the times that extra heat and wear and tear can actually lead to severe damage. A lot of the times the leading cause of issues with laptops is just excessive heat. Battery degradation and excessive heat are pretty much the #1 killers of laptops. Like, I have, throughout the years of just being the family IT person, I have interacted with enough laptops to pretty much just understand that that is pretty much the general thing that ends up killing laptops. It's heat. So there is merit if you are someone who is worried about these temperatures, that maybe you just want that 15 watts and you're willing to take the hit in terms of performance. And as you see, at least in this game, it doesn't make that big of a difference. Now, obviously, the temperatures that you get are going to depend on your ambient temperatures, but at least here where I am, while running this at 15 watts, you saw that the chip was not even really reaching 60 degrees. And now at the 25 watts, we're looking at 77 degrees, and it will sometimes go higher than that. It hasn't fully saturated yet. So in that scenario, I mean, that is a huge increase in temperature, and at least in this game, we aren't seeing any benefit to that. So it's one of those things where it might help you to just mess around with settings, and it really depends on the games that you're playing. So I would really encourage you to experiment, try things out, see what works best for you, because you might just be better off saving yourself the wear and tear on your system and running it at the stock TDP. There is for sure some performance to be gained, and maybe if you're using an external monitor, and depending on the type of game that you're playing, it might be worthwhile. But as it is right now with this game, I would just keep things at the stock TDP and play it at 720p, because even at 25 watts, the TDP is not really making any difference here that is worthwhile, especially when it comes to the temperature. 720p with the lowest graphical settings is pretty much going to give you the best experience with the 15 watts TDP, because you're going to get that 60 FPS experience most of the time, and you're going to get those cool temperatures. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.